Okay, let's dive right into this explainer, where we are going to unpack 3 true stories with twists so genuinely shocking they feel like they were ripped straight out of a Hollywood movie script. But I assure you, they are 100% real. You usually think you know exactly how a mystery is going to unfold, right? Well, the cases we're looking at today are going to completely shatter every single one of those expectations. Here's our roadmap for today. First up, we'll examine the Sharon Marshall enigma. Second, we'll uncover the terror of the Crow of Valone. Third, we're unraveling the imposture of Texas. And finally, we'll look at the lingering, unsolved mysteries of these cases. All right, Section 1, the Sharon Marshall enigma, a web of lies. We're starting our first case with Sharon Marshall, a brilliant high schooler with aerospace dreams, whose life took a very dark turn after a hidden pregnancy. So picture this. Sharon actually gave up a college scholarship, moved down to Florida, and wound up living with a much older, highly aggressive guy named Franklin Delano Floyd. To make ends meet and just survive, she had to turn to exotic dancing and welfare. Now, while working, she became really close friends with an 18-year-old coworker named Cheryl Camesso. The catch? Frank and Cheryl absolutely despised each other. Following an argument on a boating trip, Cheryl reportedly called social services to report Sharon for misrepresenting her income, which completely severed Sharon's welfare checks. While Frank was literally enraged, he violently confronted Cheryl right outside the club where the women worked, even going so far as to punch her in the face. So what actually happened to Cheryl Camesso? Well, shortly after that intense physical altercation in 1989, she just disappeared. She was supposed to travel to a friend's house, but instead her abandoned Corvette was just sitting there at the airport. Now, police definitely looked at both Frank and Sharon, but with zero physical evidence, the couple just packed up and fled using fake names, and it left this really chilling, lingering mystery. Where on earth did Cheryl go? Okay, this is where it gets wild. The mystery of her disappearance was finally solved years later in just the most incredibly unexpected way. In 1995, skeletal remains were discovered out in the woods in Florida. Later that exact same year, halfway across the country, a mechanic in Kansas bought an abandoned truck at an auction. And inside, he found this terrifying envelope containing 97 photographs of a woman who had clearly been beaten and bound. It turned out that specific truck had been stolen and later abandoned by Frank Floyd. Investigators noticed a distinct wound on the woman's cheek in the photos that perfectly matched the recovered skull in Florida. Because of that, the remains were positively identified as Cheryl Camesso. Let's track Frank's timeline for a second, because it reveals a chaotic, violent life that spans decades. I mean, he had a long history of violent abductions, starting all the way back in the 1960s. Then, in 1989, Sharon tragically died in a highly suspicious hit-and-run where Frank actually tried to claim her life insurance under an alias. Frank was eventually arrested, and Sharon's young son Michael was put into foster care. But the nightmare didn't end. In 1994, Frank was released, literally held a school principal at gunpoint, and kidnapped Michael. And it wasn't until 2014 that Frank finally confessed he had murdered young Michael while they were on the run. But hold on. Remember those 97 photographs the mechanic found in the truck? Authorities found some older photos mixed in that same envelope, showing Frank assaulting a young girl. When investigators started digging to identify this child, it led them to uncover a truly horrific reality. Get ready for this, because Sharon Marshall wasn't just a high school prodigy who fell in with the wrong crowd. She was actually Suzanne Savarkis. Back in the 1970s, Frank had kidnapped his own wife's children. He raised young Suzanne under various aliases, subjected her to years of horrific, continuous abuse, and eventually forced her to marry him. He literally stole his own stepdaughter's life, forcing her to exist in a completely fabricated, nightmarish reality. Moving to Section 2, the Crow of Valone. A village haunted. Our next unbelievable case takes us over to eastern France in the 1980s. Here, the very successful Villemain family became the target of anonymous, terrifying threats. Jean-Marie Villemain had just been promoted to a factory foreman, and he and his wife Christine were living a really happy life with their young son Gregory. But out of nowhere, the family began receiving these anonymous phone calls and letters promising some really dark revenge. Imagine dealing with that kind of harassment for 4 agonizing years. It all culminated in the tragic 1984 kidnapping and drowning of 4-year-old Gregory. His uncle actually received a phone call from the killer, straight up claiming he threw the boy into the river. The very next day, the family found this haunting letter in the mail. The French public and media dubbed the killer the Crow, which was a reference to a famous French film.
And the French investigation, it quickly descended into absolute chaos. Seriously, almost everyone in the family became a suspect at some point, and it completely tore the Villemans apart. First, Jean-Marie's cousin Bernard Laroche was arrested based on handwriting and a teenage relative's statement. But when Bernard was freed, Jean-Marie actually took matters into his own hands and shot Bernard dead at his workplace. Then, in just an unthinkable twist, Gregory's own mother, Christine, was charged based on handwriting analysis. She was pregnant at the time and went on a grueling 11-day hunger strike to protest her innocence, tragically miscarrying a twin before finally being cleared years later. The case has kept reopening, even leading to the arrests of extended family members as late as 2017, though no one was ever convicted.
So, jump to 2020. Police reopened the case again, but this time relying on something called stylometrics. It's this fascinating scientific approach that analyzes the specific cadence, syntax, and even the subconscious punctuation habits of an author. These are traits that are honestly much harder to fake than handwriting. Authorities have actually identified a new suspect using this method, which is bringing fresh hope to a case that has absolutely devastated France for decades. All right, Section 3. The Imposter of Texas, an impossible return. For our third case, we're traveling to San Antonio, Texas. The year is 1994, and a troubled 13-year-old named Nicholas Barkley vanishes. Now, Nicholas had a bit of a juvenile record, so police initially just assumed he ran away. For 3 long years, his family heard absolutely nothing. But then they get a miraculous phone call. Nicholas has been found alive in Spain. The Barkley family was understandably overjoyed to have him back, but they were willfully accepting some incredibly extraordinary explanations. The boy in Spain claimed a trafficking ring had kidnapped him and dragged him all the way to Europe. When his older sister Carrie flew out to identify him, he kept a hat and sunglasses on the whole time. He spoke with a really heavy French accent, claiming his captors had forced him to speak only French. But most bizarrely of all, he claimed his kidnappers chemically altered his blonde hair and blue eyes to dark hair and brown eyes. I mean, think about that for a second.
So why did Nicholas look and sound so completely different? Well, Carrie brought him back to Texas, and the family seemingly welcomed him home with open arms. But a local private investigator, along with a film crew who happened to be following the reunion, became highly suspicious. The private investigator took close-up photos of the boy's ears and compared them to old photos of Nicholas. The ears didn't match. This prompted the FBI to step in, secure a court order for DNA and fingerprints, and they uncovered a reality that is definitely stranger than fiction.
That DNA and those fingerprints revealed a staggering truth. This was not Nicholas. The boy was actually a 23-year-old Frenchman named Frederic Bourdin. Frederic was a notorious con artist, known over there as the Chameleon, who had assumed over 500 different identities across Europe. He was a full decade older than Nicholas and looked nothing like him, yet he had somehow managed to infiltrate an American home, sleep in their house, and live as their missing son.
Frederic ultimately pleaded guilty to passport fraud and perjury and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. But he ended up raising a genuinely chilling question himself about why the Barkley family just ignored all those glaring inconsistencies. Frederic claimed that Carrie had actually fed him knowledge about the family, essentially coaching him on what to remember so he could easily pass the police tests. He said he was completely baffled as to why they played along with his scheme.
Now, we absolutely must note that this is entirely speculative, but the private investigator and Frederic pointed to a very suspicious phone call from Nicholas's older brother, Jason. You see, 3 months after Nicholas vanished, Jason called the police claiming he heard his brother breaking into their garage, even though no evidence of a break-in was ever found. Investigators noted that these types of calls are actually often made by culprits trying to establish that a victim is still alive. So a theory emerged that the family accepted Frederic just to shut down the investigation and cover up a potential murder by Jason. Unfortunately, before Jason could be fully investigated, he died of a drug overdose, taking whatever secrets he might have had to the grave.
Which brings us to our final section, lingering unsolved mysteries. As we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a really unsettling reality. Despite all these massive twists and turns, absolute justice and the whole truth remained completely elusive.
While we've unraveled all these fake identities and exposed the imposters, the core tragedies at the center of all 3 of these stories are still open mysteries today. Frank Floyd is sitting on death row for Cheryl Comesso's murder, sure, but he absolutely refuses to talk about Sharon's hit and run, leaving it officially unsolved. And despite his confession, young Michael's body was never found. Over in France, the true identity of the Crow who murdered young Gregory remains unconfirmed. And as for the real Nicholas Barkley, nobody knows what happened to him that day in Texas. So it leaves us with one massive question.
As forensics and stylometrics continue to advance to levels we couldn't have even imagined back in the 80s and 90s, will we ever actually find out what truly happened to Sharon, Gregory, and Nicholas? Or are some truths so deeply buried beneath webs of lies and imposters that they are destined to stay hidden forever? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep your eyes open out there because as we've seen today, the truth is often far stranger and way darker than fiction.